It's April 4th, 1968. A large crowd is gathered to hear Martin Luther King, the leader of America's civil rights movement, speak. Suddenly, a shot rings out through the air, and in that single, heart-shattering instant, the dream of a better America begins to bleed. A great man is gone, and something sacred dies with him. He had marched, bled, and been jailed for the souls of a people America tried to erase. He gave his life trying to redeem a nation that repaid him with a bullet. The government points to a petty thief named James Earl Ray. They say justice is served. But deep down, we know that's not true, because some things aren't adding up. How did a petty thief escape from prison, flee the country, and evade authorities for months? And why were there not definitive ballistics left on the scene? Why had the witnesses that reported other men fleeing the scene been silenced or suppressed? And why did the government later openly admit that Ray hadn't acted alone? That he was part of a larger conspiracy? None of this is in the mainstream narrative. All of this was systematically swept under the rug on purpose. Today we're breaking down the facts, the cover-ups, and the damning evidence that made even MLK's family believe the official story was a lie. Because it's time to ask the question no one wants to answer. Did the FBI kill Martin Luther King Jr.? America, late 1960s. While the Vietnam War starts picking up more attention from newsrooms and media sources, there's another secret war going on between two of the most powerful men in America. One of them wielded the immense opaque power of the United States Federal Bureau of Investigations. He had already been hunting black people for decades. The other man belonged to America's long-oppressed minority and fought this war using the weapons of compelling words and a deep philosophical commitment to nonviolent protest. That's right, we're talking about J. Edgar Hoover and Martin Luther King Jr. In the 1960s America, nonviolence turned out to be an incredibly powerful tool for waging this struggle, because it always resulted in the same thing: the inevitable crackdown of excessive violence by law enforcement and counter-protesters. And when that was then covered and shown to the general population, it was so starkly clear who was right and who was wrong in the situation. From jail, King wrote a letter about why he was leading these demonstrations in Birmingham. In April 1963, King sent a letter from Birmingham jail. We know through painful experience that freedom is never voluntarily given by the oppressor. It must be demanded by the oppressed. And that now was their time, for they had waited for more than 340 years for their God-given constitutional rights. And for King, this strategy was working. Already, dozens of nonviolent protests had been met with force, with everything being captured on film. King was starting to force America to come to face with their brutal racism. Thankfully, this strategy for equality worked. It elevated the movement to an unambiguous moral high ground that couldn't be put down by force and arrests and violence by law enforcement. But King and his allies were challenging the centuries-old system of slavery and white supremacy. And when you disrupt a system like that, you create enemies, vicious, violent, racist enemies. His enemies included those that you would imagine, like the White Knights of the Klan, whose leaders allied with local police in the South and who stated that terminating MLK would eliminate all racial problems in the South. You also had pro-segregation groups like the White Citizens Council, who tried to convince the federal government that King's growing movement had communist connections. But the sad fact is that it wasn't just these overtly bigoted racist groups who were targeting King. His enemies also included business owners, real estate developers, landlords, employers, all of whom benefited from the status quo. The status quo of racism, of discrimination in hiring practices, and of keeping black people out of the housing market. Then, of course, there were a whole bunch of lawmakers and governors, most of them from the South. But these groups didn't cause the most trouble for King. Among King's worst enemies was a group that was unimaginably powerful. A group who was supposed to protect Americans and to enforce the laws of the country, but instead had been weaponized to threaten and blackmail black people. They were the FBI. Hoover had served as the FBI's director for decades, his main objective to destroy any black individual who gained too much power. As King's movement grew, Hoover grew increasingly disgusted with the new rights and liberties black people were receiving. Determined to destroy the civil rights movement, Hoover claimed that King was a secret communist, plotting to sow division in American society. What followed was a declaration of war against Black America, a relentless campaign by the United States government to hunt, harass, and psychologically dismantle one black man who dared to challenge their power. It began with wiretaps and hidden agents, but quickly escalated into a full-scale operation of character assassination, blackmail, and mental warfare. And for many, it ended exactly how all wars against black leaders in America end, with a bullet. But of course, this was one of many times the American government actively waged war on its own people, specifically black folks. Throughout history, there have been hundreds of stories that have been intentionally buried and hidden from us. If you want to learn more and uncover real facts, subscribe to our channel. Initially, Hoover justified this invasive operation under the guise of investigating King's supposed communist ties. At the height of the Cold War, the mere accusation of communist sympathies was a career-ending charge for any public figure. It was the perfect excuse for Hoover to destroy the civil rights movement and everything King stood for. Imagine for a moment your every move, every conversation, every private thought being secretly recorded, documented, and scrutinized by the most powerful agency in America. That's exactly what Martin Luther King faced. Under Hoover's obsessive direction, the FBI wiretapped King's phones, bugged hotel rooms, and placed hidden microphones wherever he traveled. Informants and undercover agents infiltrated King's inner circle, reporting back every move he made, every word he spoke. No stone was left unturned, no moment went unobserved. But here's where things get interesting. After years of extensive monitoring, the FBI's own intelligence reports repeatedly concluded that there were absolutely no significant communist connections within King's movement. There were no Soviet spies, no secret funding, nothing at all to substantiate Hoover's wild claims. But of course, that's not what Hoover wanted to hear. Hoover wanted any excuse possible to be able to put a bullet between King's eyes. And so, the FBI doubled down on their surveillance, actively weaponizing every crumb of info they gathered to obliterate King's legitimacy. Hoover orchestrated a calculated campaign of psychological warfare aimed at completely destroying King's credibility and influence. Step 1. Flood the media with disinformation. The FBI manufactured scandalous rumors, meticulously planting stories that painted King as morally bankrupt, untrustworthy, and deceitful. Newspapers unknowingly ran with stories alleging King engaged in countless immoral acts, and accusations flew that he was secretly misusing funds from the civil rights movement. Every piece of misinformation was carefully calibrated to dismantle the reputation King had painstakingly built. But slandering King publicly wasn't enough. Hoover needed to break him personally, sending his wife, Coretta Scott King, secretly recorded tapes and anonymous letters filled with shocking accusations of infidelity. The goal was simple, yet ruthless: shatter their marriage, undermine King's emotional stability, and strip away his personal support system. But the FBI's sinister tactics didn't stop at America's borders. When King was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 1964, Hoover's paranoia escalated to an international scale. FBI agents secretly lobbied global influencers and members of the Nobel Committee directly, attempting to convince them King was morally compromised and undeserving of the honor. They painted him as a dangerous political figure, hoping these influential figures would withdraw their support and prevent King from receiving the prestigious award. But despite all those efforts, all the aggressive behind-the-scenes sabotage, Hoover and the full force of the FBI failed spectacularly. This relentless persecution reached its darkest chapter with the infamous letter. It was a desperate attempt from the FBI, who genuinely believed they could push King to silence himself forever. Despite the mounting pressure and the constant surveillance, he kept going. In 1964, he accepted the Nobel Peace Prize in Oslo. He continued to lead nonviolent protests across the country, spoke out against systemic racism, and even began criticizing U.S. involvement in the Vietnam War, broadening his moral campaign for justice. Hoover's efforts to discredit him failed to gain traction with the public. Even members of Congress, some of whom had initially supported the surveillance, began to distance themselves from Hoover's personal crusade. The tapes and letters meant to destroy King's marriage were disregarded by his allies. In the end, Hoover's smear campaign didn't just fall flat. It amplified the perception that King was being unjustly persecuted, and that's what made King even more dangerous in Hoover's eyes. Not only had he survived the most aggressive psychological campaign ever waged by the U.S. government against a single citizen, he had come out of it more respected, more recognized, and more powerful than ever. All of it was reaching a boiling point, one that would soon erupt in a single violent moment that changed American history forever. It's April 4th, 1968. Martin Luther King Jr. steps out onto the balcony of the Lorraine Motel in Memphis, Tennessee, where he's staying while supporting a sanitation workers' strike. Moments later, a gunshot echoes through the air. The man who spent his life preaching nonviolence drops where he stands, surrounded by close friends who immediately point toward the direction of the gunfire. Within hours, the official story begins to form. The shooter, according to the FBI and Memphis police, was a man named James Earl Ray, a small-time crook who had escaped from Missouri State Penitentiary the year before by hiding in a bread truck. Officials claimed Ray rented a room in the flophouse across from the Lorraine Motel, fired the shot from a shared bathroom window, then fled on foot, leaving behind a bundle containing a rifle, binoculars, and personal items, which was found nearby and linked to him. From there, he allegedly traveled from Memphis to Atlanta, then to Canada, used a fake alias to obtain a passport, flew to London, and continued on to Lisbon before being arrested at Heathrow Airport 2 months later. But for many, this version of events has never made sense. For one, how did Ray, an escaped convict with a history of petty crimes, manage to evade one of the largest manhunts in U.S. history and escape the country? Ray, we're told, traveled from Atlanta to Canada, obtained a passport under a fake name, flew to England, and then continued on to Portugal, all without being caught. It wasn't until 2 months later, at Heathrow Airport in London, that British authorities finally apprehended him. You know, it doesn't really sound like the actions of a petty thief, almost like he was set up, a puppet in a game much bigger than himself, with the puppeteer master being the organization that had publicly vilified King for the past 15 years. What's even stranger is that key pieces of evidence went missing or were never collected at all. Witnesses who were in the area reported seeing men fleeing the scene, but their statements were either ignored or suppressed. The crime scene itself, the boarding house where Ray allegedly fired the fatal shot, was tampered with. There was no ballistics test that definitively tied the rifle found at the scene to the bullet that terminated King. And despite being arrested, Ray never stood trial. He entered a guilty plea on the advice of his attorney, Percy Foreman, in exchange for avoiding the death penalty. A deal reached under suspicious circumstances, given the international spotlight and lack of concrete forensic evidence. Just 3 days later, Ray recanted his confession, stating under oath that he had been coerced into pleading guilty and that he was merely a pawn in a much larger conspiracy. He claimed he was manipulated by a mysterious man named Raoul, whom he said had directed his actions for months leading up to the assassination. Over the next 3 decades, Ray repeatedly tried to withdraw his plea and demanded a trial to present new evidence, but his requests were consistently denied. What followed was decades of skepticism and renewed investigations by journalists, King family members, and even members of Congress. In 1999, a Memphis civil court case was brought by the King family against Lloyd Jowers, a Memphis restaurant owner who claimed he was part of a conspiracy to dispatch King. Over 4 weeks of testimony from over 70 witnesses, including former FBI agents, police officers, and informants. The case laid out evidence that pointed toward a broad plot. The jury unanimously found that King was not assassinated by a lone gunman, but as the result of a conspiracy involving governmental entities. They concluded that Jowers had acted as part of a larger network that included elements of the Memphis Police Department, local organized crime figures, and federal agencies, including the FBI. The jury also heard evidence that the FBI had prior knowledge of threats to King's life and failed to act, and that government agencies had both motive and means to carry out or facilitate the termination. Even Coretta Scott King, Martin's widow, publicly stated that the trial confirmed what the family had long believed, that the government had been deeply involved in the assassination and the cover-up that followed. To this day, many believe the official story doesn't add up, and when you consider everything the FBI had already done to try to destroy King — surveillance, blackmail, character assassination — his death raises the most chilling question of all. If the most powerful law enforcement agency in America spent years trying to ruin King's life, could they have also been involved in ending it? Today, more than half a century after his death, the questions still haven't gone away. In fact, they've only grown louder. According to a 2019 poll by the Washington Post and Ipsos, 88% of Black Americans believe the official story of King's assassination is either incomplete or entirely false. That's not a fringe belief. It's the overwhelming majority of the very community King fought for, and they're not alone. Every one of King's children has publicly stated that they do not believe James Earl Ray acted alone. Some have even gone further, declaring that Ray was innocent entirely. Civil rights leaders like Congressman John Lewis and Ambassador Andrew Young, both of whom marched with King, also expressed serious doubts. Lewis said it outright: "I think there was a major conspiracy to remove Dr. King from the American scene." In the late 1970s, the U.S. House Select Committee on Assassinations concluded that while Ray pulled the trigger, he likely did not act alone. Their final report cited the likelihood of a conspiracy and criticized the FBI for its role in failing to properly investigate the broader circumstances surrounding the assassination. But perhaps the most damning revelations didn't come from the government at all. They came from that 1999 civil trial. While the earlier section discussed the verdict, what hasn't been mentioned yet is the context around it. The U.S. media barely covered it. The New York Times acknowledged the jury's decision, but noted that it had little effect, reflecting how the story failed to generate further public attention or investigation. Major networks like CNN, ABC, and NBC offered little to no primetime coverage, and the trial was almost entirely absent from nightly news broadcasts. In stark contrast to the saturation coverage of other high-profile trials, this one, a case alleging government conspiracy in the termination of one of America's greatest civil rights leaders, was met with silence. Most Americans have never heard of the trial. The Justice Department refused to reopen the case. The King family didn't ask for money. They weren't seeking revenge. They wanted truth, and when the truth came out, it was buried. To this day, no one from any agency has been held accountable. And maybe that's the final injustice. Not just that a man who preached peace was taken in violence, but that even now, the full truth remains locked away, classified, dismissed, or forgotten. Because if what happened to Martin Luther King Jr. can be buried, what else has already been erased? If the FBI was afraid of Martin Luther King Jr., wait until you see what they did to the man who scared them even more. Click here to watch our video on Fred Hampton, the black man who terrified the FBI. This was Black Stories Untold, and as always, thanks for watching.